They were ghosts in the Wyoming snow, 4 children left to fade where no one was meant to look. Jed Waverly hadn't sought them out, but the winter of 1882 had other plans, pulling him to the Union Pacific tracks like a thread through a needle's eye. A widower at 40, Jed had built his life on solitude, his heart a locked door since his wife, Clara, passed a decade ago. His graying beard and weathered face told of years under the prairie's unforgiving sky, but his blue eyes held a stubborn spark refusing to dim. That morning, a whisper he couldn't name turned his mare, Sadie, toward the rails. When he saw them, small, shivering forms huddled by a telegraph pole, his world shifted, and a choice he never planned to make would bind him to their fate. The prairie sprawled under a sky heavy with gray, the wind cutting through Jed's wool coat like a knife through canvas. He'd risen before dawn, his breath clouding in the cold as he saddled Sadie to check fences on his small ranch. A half-day's ride from Laramie. The Union Pacific tracks were 3 miles off his usual path, a detour he hadn't intended. Yet, as he sipped bitter coffee by his cabin's fire, his hands had moved of their own accord, steering Sadie toward the rails. The snow crunched beneath her hooves, the only sound in a world wrapped in silence. A hawk circled above, its wings slicing the stillness, and Jed's eyes narrowed at the horizon. Something felt wrong, like a note out of tune in a song he didn't know he was hearing. Near a leaning telegraph pole, the snow looked disturbed, not drifted by wind, but shifted, as if someone had tried to hide their tracks. Jed dismounted, his boots sinking into the crust, his gloved hand steadying Sadie's reins. His coat, patched at the elbows, flapped in the wind, and his scarf, a faded red, tugged loose. He approached cautiously, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Then he saw them, pressed against the iron rail like it could shield them from the cold. 4 children, nearly invisible in the snow, their forms so still, he first thought them abandoned blankets. The oldest, a boy of about 11, had wild brown hair frozen to his brow, his green eyes fierce but sunken. His arms cradled 2 girls, 1, maybe 9. Her dark curls spilling from a tattered shawl, her lips cracked. The other, 6 or so, her nose crusted with blood, her eyes dull from the cold. The smallest, a toddler no older than 2, was a bundle of rags, her tiny hands purple, her breath a faint, flickering wisp. Jed's heart lurched, a pang he hadn't felt since Clara's fever took her, leaving him with nothing but a quiet cabin and a cottonwood cross. He knelt, his knees crunching the snow, his voice low, rough, from years of speaking more to horses than men. "Hey now, you all right?" The boy flinched, his voice a rasp, sharp with defiance. "We didn't steal nothing." Jed's chest tightened, no tears, no cries, just a wall of silence, as if these kids had learned the world turned its back on weakness. The 9-year-old bit her lip, blood welling, her hands clutching the shawl. The 6-year-old stared blankly, her fingers twitching in her lap. The toddler's eyes fluttered, barely open, her breath so faint Jed feared it might stop. He didn't think, just acted. He shed his coat, the cold biting his flannel shirt, and wrapped the toddler tight against his chest, her small weight a shock against his ribs. Her head lolled, her breath warming his collarbone. The boy tensed, shielding the girls, his eyes darting like a cornered animal's. Jed kept his tone even, his blue eyes steady. "You can freeze here, or you can come with me. Your call." The boy's jaw clenched, his gaze flicking to the toddler, then back to Jed. After a long moment, he nodded, once, sharp, like a door creaking open. Jed lifted the 6-year-old next, her frame light as a sparrow's, her body rigid in his arms. He draped his scarf over the 9-year-old, its red wool stark against her pale face, and helped her stand, her legs wobbling. The boy rose last, his hands fisted, refusing aid. Their clothes, thin shirts, no coats, patched trousers, were no match for the wind's teeth. Jed hoisted them onto Sadie, the mare standing patient, her breath steaming. He wrapped his one blanket, a gray wool square around them, tucking it tight. The boy climbed up last, his eyes never leaving Jed, a silent challenge. Jed mounted behind them, his arms a makeshift shield around the small, shivering forms. Sadie's, warmth their only anchor. The ride to his ranch was slow, the snow deepening as the sky darkened to slate. Jed's thoughts churned, memories of Clara surfacing unbidden, her laughter by the fire, her dreams of a child they never had, her hand cold in his as she slipped away. His cabin, a squat refuge of weathered pine, had held only silence since. Why had he stopped? Why these kids, half dead by the tracks? The toddler stirred, her breath stronger, her small hand clutching his shirt. Jed's grip tightened, his jaw set. He didn't know their names, their story, but he knew he couldn't leave them to the snow's mercy. The ranch came into view, its chimney smoke curling like a faint promise. Jed dismounted, carrying the toddler, her weight grounding him. The boy slid off Sadie, helping the girls, his eyes old beyond his years, asking a question Jed couldn't answer yet. The cabin's door creaked open, its sparse interior, wooden table, lone chair, cold hearth, unready for the life it was about to hold. Could Jed's silent cabin become a haven for these children, or would their past bring a storm he wasn't prepared to face? The Wyoming wind howled outside Jed Waverly's cabin, but inside, a fragile warmth flickered, kindled by 4 small strangers who'd stumbled into his life. The children, pulled from the snow by the Union Pacific tracks, sat silent by his hearth, their eyes carrying stories too heavy for their years. Jed, a man who'd long preferred solitude to company, moved with quiet purpose, stoking the fire and offering what little he had. Blankets, water, a place to breathe. The oldest boy's wary gaze followed him, a challenge wrapped in fear, while the toddler's faint stirrings tugged at Jed's buried heart. As the fire crackled, he wondered, could a man who'd lost everything build a home for those who'd never had one? The cabin's pine walls creaked under the weight of the storm, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp wool. Jed had carried the children inside at dusk, their shivering forms a stark contrast to the emptiness he'd grown used to. The hearth, barely glowing, was now ablaze, its light dancing across their faces. The oldest boy, 11 or so, sat against the wall, his wild brown hair thawing, his green eyes fixed on Jed like a hawk tracking a shadow. The 9-year-old girl, her dark curls tangled, clutched a tattered shawl, her lips still bloodied from biting them. The 6-year-old, her nose, no longer bleeding, stared at the flames, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The toddler, a girl no more than 2, lay wrapped in Jed's coat on a pallet, her purpled fingers twitching as warmth returned. Jed knelt by the fire, adding a log, his graying beard catching the glow. His flannel shirt, patched at the cuffs, was damp from the ride, but he ignored the chill. He'd lived alone since Clara's death, his days filled with fence mending and cattle drives, his nights with silence. This cabin, with its single table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed, wasn't built for company, let alone 4 half-frozen kids. Yet here they were, and Jed felt a stirring he couldn't name. Part duty, part something softer, like the memory of Clara's hand in his. He rose, fetching a tin kettle from the stove, its steam curling in the cold. Pouring water into a chipped mug, he let it cool before offering it to the 6-year-old. She shook her head, her eyes darting to the boy. The boy's jaw tightened, but he took the mug, sipping once before passing it to the 9-year-old. She drank slowly, her hands trembling, then handed it back. Jed nodded, setting the mug by the toddler, whose breath was steadier now, a faint whistle in her sleep. "It'll wait," he murmured, his voice low, not wanting to spook them. They didn't cry, didn't speak, and that silence cut deeper than the wind outside. Jed pulled 3 blankets from a trunk, threadbare, smelling of cedar, and draped them over the children, tucking the edges around the toddler. The boy shifted, as if to protest, but stayed still, his eyes never leaving Jed. Jed didn't push, just moved to the table, slicing a loaf of stale bread with his knife. He set the pieces on a tin plate, adding a small wedge of cheese from his stores. "Eat if you want," he said, stepping back to give them space. The 6-year-old reached for a crumb, then froze, glancing at the boy. He nodded, and she took it, chewing slowly. The 9-year-old followed, her fingers hesitant, while the boy ate last, his gaze still locked on Jed. Night deepened, the storm rattling the shutters. Jed sat by the hearth, his rifle propped against the wall, not for threat, but for comfort, their comfort, to show he'd stay. His blue eyes traced the children's faces, searching for clues to their story. Why were they alone, dressed in rags, left by the tracks? He thought of Clara, her dreams of a child they'd never held, her laughter that once filled this room. The cabin had been hollow since, but tonight it felt different, like a heart starting to beat again. The toddler whimpered, a small sound that eased Jed's chest. She was fighting, and that was enough for now. The boy hadn't moved, his back rigid against the wall. Jed met his gaze, seeing a weight no child should carry. "You don't owe me nothing," Jed said, his voice soft but firm. "Just rest." The boy didn't nod, but his shoulders eased, a fraction, like a knot loosening. Jed leaned back, his head against the chair, memories of Clara surfacing, her sewing by the fire, her voice singing hymns. He'd thought he'd buried that warmth with her. But these kids, silent and broken, had stirred it awake. He didn't know their names, didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he couldn't turn away. As the fire's glow faded, Jed stayed awake, watching the children's chests rise and fall. The cabin, once a tomb, held a fragile promise. But the world outside was cruel, and their past wouldn't stay buried forever. What secrets did these silent children carry, and could Jed's cabin shield them from the storm waiting to break? The Wyoming winter held Jed Waverly's ranch in its icy grip, but inside his cabin, a fragile warmth grew, nurtured by the presence of 4 children who'd been left to die by the rails. Days passed, and their silence began to soften, like snow melting under a timid sun. Jed, a man who'd once thought his heart too scarred to feel, moved with quiet care, offering food and space, watching for signs of trust in their wary eyes. The oldest boy's guarded stare, the girl's hesitant movements, and the toddler's small stirrings wove a thread of purpose into Jed's solitary life. Yet, as the fire burned bright, a shadow loomed, secrets unspoken, and a world outside that wouldn't let these children rest easy. The cabin's hearth glowed, casting light across the pine floorboards, worn smooth by years of Jed's solitary steps. The storm had eased, leaving a brittle quiet that amplified every sound, the creak of a chair, the pop of a log, the faint breath of the toddler, Finn, asleep in a nest of blankets. Jed stood by the stove, stirring a pot of beans, the savory scent mingling with wood smoke. His graying beard was dusted with flour from the morning's biscuits, his blue eyes scanning the children huddled near the fire. Rowan, the 11-year-old boy, sat with his back to the wall, his wild brown hair less tangled now, his green eyes tracking Jed's every move. Wren, the 9-year-old, her dark curls tucked under a borrowed scarf, clutched her knees, her lips no longer bleeding but still chapped. Laya, the 6-year-old, her nose healed, fidgeted with a frayed thread on her shirt, her eyes darting between her siblings. Finn, barely 2, curled against Rowan, her tiny hands less purple, her breath a soft rhythm. Jed set a tin plate on the table, piled with beans and biscuits, the steam curling in the cold air. "Food's ready," he said, his voice low, like he was coaxing a skittish colt. He stepped back, giving them space, his flannel shirt damp from hauling wood. The children didn't move at first. Rowan's gaze flicked to the plate, then to Jed, as if weighing a trap. Finally he rose, taking a biscuit and breaking it into pieces, handing them to Wren and Laya. Wren nibbled hers, her eyes on Rowan, while Laya ate quickly, crumbs falling to her lap. Rowan offered a piece to Finn, who gummed it sleepily, her small face smudged with soot. Jed watched, his chest tight. They ate like they expected the food to vanish, like they'd learned to ration hope. He'd been alone so long, the cabin's silence his only companion since Clara's passing. Her memory lingered in the quilt on his bed, the chipped teapot she'd loved, the dreams of a family they'd never built. These kids, with their ragged clothes and guarded hearts, were a jolt to that quiet. Jed didn't know their story, but he saw their strength. No tears, no complaints, just a stubborn will to survive. He fetched a bucket of water from the well outside, the wind biting his ungloved hands, and left the door ajar, a signal they could leave if they wanted. They didn't. Rowan's eyes followed him through the crack, not with trust, but with less fear. By the third day, the cabin felt less like a stranger to their presence. Jed worked outside, mending a fence under a sky clearing to pale blue, his breath steaming. He glanced at the door, catching Laya's small form in the threshold, holding an empty tin cup in both hands. Her shirt, too big, hung off her shoulders, her bare feet red from the cold. Jed didn't turn, just kept hammering. "That's a fine cup you got there," he said, his tone easy. She didn't speak, her eyes flicking to the sky like a rabbit's, then stepped forward, holding it out. He took it gently, filling it from his water skin, and handed it back. She met his gaze for a second, quick and sharp, then darted inside, her feet leaving small prints in the snow. That night, Jed sat by the fire, his knife carving strips of leather from an old saddle. The children slept. Finn's soft snores a quiet melody. He shaped the leather into small boots, crude but sturdy, stuffing them with scraps of wool for warmth. He left them by the hearth, near Laya's pallet, saying nothing. Morning came, and the boots were gone, her feet now covered, no longer bleeding. Jed caught her glance, a flicker of something, not thanks, but acknowledgement. Rowan watched, his shoulders less rigid, his green eyes softer, though still wary. Jed leaned against the table, sipping coffee, the mug warm in his calloused hands. Clara's voice echoed in his mind, singing hymns by this same fire, her dreams of children filling the cabin. He'd thought that dream died with her, but these kids, their small gestures, Laya's cup, Rowan's shared biscuit, Finn's snores, stirred it awake. He didn't know how to be a father, didn't know if he could be, but he knew he couldn't send them back to the cold. The firelight danced, and Jed felt a warmth he hadn't earned, a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Outside, the prairie stretched vast and unforgiving, hiding the secrets these children carried, secrets that might soon knock at his door. Could Jed's quiet acts of care break through their walls, or would the past they fled bring a reckoning to his doorstep? The Wyoming winter began to loosen its hold on Jed Waverly's ranch, but the chill of the children's past lingered, a shadow in their silent glances. Jed, a man who'd once thought his life's warmth died with his wife Clara, found purpose in their small steps toward trust. Laya's new boots, Rowan's shared biscuit, Finn's soft snores. Yet the world beyond the prairie wasn't kind to strays, and whispers from Laramie's townsfolk hinted at trouble brewing. When Maybel Dunly, a woman scarred by gossip but rich in heart, stepped into their lives, the cabin's quiet began to hum with possibility. As Jed watched her kindness weave into the children's days, he wondered if this fragile family could hold against the storm he felt coming. The cabin's hearth glowed steady now, its light softening the pine walls that had once echoed only Jed's solitude. Morning sun filtered through the frost-etched window, painting the floorboards gold. Jed stood at the stove, flipping cornbread in a skillet, the sizzle mingling with the scent of coffee. His graying beard was flecked with ash from stoking the fire, his blue eyes scanning the children by the table. Rowan, 11, sat with his wild brown hair tied back with a bit of twine, his green eyes less sharp, but still watchful, Wren, 9. Her dark curls freed from her scarf, traced a crack in the table with her finger, her face softer now. Laya, 6, wore her leather boots, her hands busy braiding a scrap of rope, her nose healed. Finn, 2, sat on a blanket, gumming. A biscuit, her tiny hands smudged with crumbs, her breath a happy huff. Jed set the cornbread on the table, alongside a jar of molasses. "Eat up," he said, his voice low, like a breeze through sagebrush. He stepped back, his flannel shirt rolled to his elbows, giving them space. Rowan took a piece, breaking it for Finn first, then Wren and Laya. Wren dipped hers in molasses, a small smile flickering, while Laya ate slowly, her eyes on Jed, no longer darting away. Jed nodded, his chest warm. These kids, in their patched shirts and borrowed scarves, were carving a place in his world, their silence giving way to small sounds, Finn's babble, Laya's rope scratching the table, Wren's quiet hum. He'd ridden to Laramie the day before, needing salt and nails. From the trading post, the town's streets were slushy, the air sharp with wood smoke and gossip. At the general store, Jed's boots thudded on the creaky floor, drawing eyes. Maybel Dunly was there, her auburn hair pinned under a faded bonnet, her hazel eyes meeting, his with a quiet strength. She'd been shunned since a scandal years back, rumors of a preacher's son and a broken promise. But Jed never cared for such talk. She handed him a jar of goose grease, her voice steady. "For their chapped hands. Winter's hard on kids." Jed took it, his calloused fingers brushing hers, a spark he didn't expect. "Obliged," he murmured, and she nodded, her basket swinging as she left. Back at the cabin, Jed applied the grease to Finn's hands, her giggle breaking the quiet like a bell. Rowan watched, his shoulders easing, and Jed caught a flicker of trust in his green eyes. That night, as the children slept, Jed found a slip of paper under his mug, the word Rowan scrawled in shaky pencil. He spoke it softly. "Rowan," and the boy stirred in his sleep, a sign of something opening. Jed sat by the fire, Clara's quilt over his knees, her memory a soft ache. These kids weren't his, but they were his now, and he'd fight to keep them safe. The next morning, a knock startled the cabin. Jed opened the door to Maybel, her bonnet dusted with snow, a basket of biscuits and soap in her arms. "Thought you might need these," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invite. Her dress, a deep green calico, rustled, and her presence filled the room like a warm wind. Rowan tensed, but Wren's eyes widened, curious. Maybel set the basket down, kneeling by Finn, who reached for a biscuit. "You're a brave one," Maybel said, her smile gentle. Finn babbled and Laya edged closer, watching Maybel's hands. Jed leaned against the wall, his coffee mug warm, seeing something he hadn't dared hope for, a woman unafraid of broken things. Maybel stayed, not pushing, just being. She showed Wren how to braid horsehair into a bracelet, her fingers deft, her voice a soft melody. Laya listened, her rope forgotten, while Rowan hovered, his gaze softening. Finn napped against Maybel's shoulder, her small hand clutching Maybel's sleeve. Jed watched from the doorway, his heart stirring. Clara had loved braiding, her laughter filling this cabin, and Maybel's quiet care echoed that warmth. He didn't know her story, only that the town had judged her unfairly. But her kindness here, with these kids, was a truth he trusted. By afternoon, Maybel sat with Wren outside, teaching her to mend a torn shawl under the eaves. Snow fell lightly, dusting their shoulders, and Wren's small hands worked the needle, her hum returning. Jed chopped wood nearby, his axe steady, glancing at them. Maybel caught his eye, her hazel gaze holding a question, a promise. He nodded, a silent thanks, and she smiled, small but real. Rowan joined them, carrying Finn, his face less guarded, his green eyes catching the light. The cabin, once a shell, hummed with life, but Jed felt a prickle of unease. Laramie's whispers wouldn't stay quiet forever. As dusk painted the prairie rose, Jed stood by the fence, his breath steaming. Maybel's kindness was a gift, but the children's past was a weight, and the town's eyes were watching, waiting for a misstep. Could Maybel's warmth help mend these broken souls? Or would the town's judgment tear this fragile family apart? The Wyoming spring crept into Jed Waverly's ranch, thawing the snow, but not the weight of the children's unspoken past. Rowan's quiet chores, Wren's soft hums, Laya's written name, and Finn's toddling steps had woven a fragile family within Jed's once silent cabin. Maybel Dunly's steady presence, her kindness a balm to their wounds, brought warmth Jed hadn't known since Clara's time. Yet, Laramie's whispers grew sharper, their judgment a storm cloud over the prairie. As the children began to share their mother's name, Delilah, and the pain of her loss, Jed felt a reckoning looming. The world didn't let strays go unclaimed, and the truth they carried might test the home he was building. The cabin's pine walls glowed under the morning sun, the frost on the windows melting into beads that caught the light. Jed stood by the stove, stirring oatmeal, the sweet scent mixing with wood smoke. His graying beard was trimmed now, his blue eyes softer as he watched the children at the table. Rowan, 11, his wild brown hair tied with twine, stacked kindling by the hearth, his green eyes less guarded. Wren, 9, her dark curls loose, helped Finn, 2, spoon oatmeal, her hum a quiet melody. Laya, 6, in her leather boots, traced letters on a slate, her face focused, her nose no longer crusted. Finn babbled, her tiny hands sticky, her laughter a spark in the room. Jed's flannel shirt, rolled to his elbows, was dusted with ash, his heart stirred by their small, growing ease. He set a plate of apples, traded in Laramie, beside the oatmeal. "Eat slow," he said, his voice warm, like a breeze over sagebrush. Rowan took an apple, slicing it with Jed's knife, sharing with his siblings. Wren smiled, her teeth stained with juice, while Laya ate hers in tiny bites, her eyes flicking to Jed with a shy trust. Finn clapped, apple mush on her chin, and Jed chuckled, a sound he hadn't heard from himself in years. The cabin, once a tomb for Clara's dreams, hummed with life. Wren's hum, Laya's slate scratching, Finn's giggles. Yet Jed felt a prickle of unease. The town's stares at the trading post, their muttered words, strays, trouble, lingered like smoke. Maybel arrived at noon, her auburn hair pinned under her bonnet, her hazel eyes bright despite the town's cold shoulder. Her green calico dress rustled as she set a basket of cornbread and yarn on the table. "For mittens," she said, kneeling by Finn, who reached for her. Rowan watched, his hands still, while Wren edged closer, curious. Maybel's fingers, deft from years of mending, guided Wren's hands to knot yarn, her voice a soft lullaby. Laya set her slate aside, leaning in, her boots tapping softly. Jed leaned against the doorframe, his coffee mug warm, seeing Clara's warmth in Maybel's care. The town called her ruined, but here, she was a mender of broken things. That afternoon, Jed worked outside, repairing a corral fence under a sky turning blue. The prairie stretched vast, its grasses poking through the snow, a promise of spring. He glanced at the cabin, where Maybel sat with the children, teaching them a clapping game. Wren laughed, a sound like bells, while Laya joined, her braids swinging. Rowan stood apart, stacking wood, but his eyes lingered on them, softer now. Jed's axe paused, his thoughts on Clara, her love for games, her dreams of a child's laughter. Maybel's presence was a bridge to that past, a spark for a future he hadn't dared imagine. At dusk, the children sat by the hearth, Finn asleep in Wren's lap. Jed stoked the fire, the glow catching Rowan's face. "Your ma," Jed said, gently. "She got a name?" Rowan's jaw tightened, his eyes on the flames. "Delilah," he whispered, the word heavy, like a stone dropped in still water. Wren's hum stopped, her hands clutching Finn. Laya looked up, her slate forgotten. "She died on the train," Rowan said, his voice tight. "Wouldn't eat, just rocked us, then stopped. They made us leave her at a stop, cold as stone." Jed's chest ached, his hand gripping the poker. "That wasn't your fault," he said, his voice steady but raw. Rowan's knees shook, but he didn't cry, just nodded once. Maybel, sitting nearby, folded her hands, her hazel eyes glistening. She'd heard the town's gossip, orphans, thieves, burdens. But here, she saw survivors. "You carried them," she said to Rowan, her voice soft. "That's more than most could do." Rowan looked away, but his shoulders eased, a weight, lifting. Jed met Maybel's gaze, a silent thanks passing between them. The firelight danced, and Jed felt the cabin shift, its walls holding not just sorrow, but stories. Delilah's loss, the children's strength, a family forming in the ashes. Later, on the porch, Jed and Maybel stood under a starlit sky, the air crisp with spring's promise. "They're opening up," Jed said, his breath steaming. "But the town's watching." Maybel nodded, her bonnet loose, her auburn hair catching the moonlight. "They always do," she said, her voice steady despite the scars of gossip. "But these kids, they're worth it." Jed's hand brushed hers, a fleeting warmth, and she didn't pull away. The prairie stretched dark and vast, hiding the children's past. But its secrets wouldn't stay buried forever. What truths lay hidden in Delilah's story, and could Jed and Maybel protect this family from the storm gathering in Laramie? The Wyoming spring brought green to Jed Waverly's ranch, but the shadow of Laramie's judgment hung heavy, threatening the fragile family he'd built with 4 orphaned children. Rowan's quiet strength, Wren's growing laughter, Laya's steady letters, and Finn's toddling joy had warmed Jed's cabin, once a silent shrine to his late wife, Clara. Maybel Dunly's unwavering kindness, her heart unbowed by town gossip, had woven her into their lives, sparking a hope Jed hadn't dared feel. Yet when a stranger arrived claiming the children for profit, Jed faced a choice that would test his resolve. As the town's eyes turned to his doorstep, he stood ready to fight, but the children's own voices would hold the key to their future. The cabin's hearth crackled, its glow softening the pine walls as evening settled over the prairie. Jed sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, his graying beard catching the firelight, his blue eyes calm but alert. Rowan, 11, stacked firewood by the door, his wild brown hair tied with twine, his green eyes steady now, less like a cornered animal's. Wren, 9, her dark curls bouncing, braided a horsehair bracelet with Maybel, her laughter a soft chime. Laya, 6, in her leather boots, wrote on her slate, her letters surer, her face glowing with pride. Finn, 2, toddled between them, her sticky hands clutching a wooden spoon, babbling "ba" like a secret code. Jed's flannel shirt, patched at the elbows, was warm from the fire, his heart fuller than it had been since Clara's time. Maybel, her auburn hair loose under her bonnet, knelt by Wren, her green calico dress brushing the floor. Her hazel eyes sparkled as she praised Wren's braid, her voice a melody that eased the room's quiet. She'd come daily now, bringing cornbread, mending clothes, teaching the children with a patience that mirrored Clara's dreams. Jed watched, his coffee mug forgotten, feeling a spark. Maybel's hand brushing his yesterday, her smile under the stars. Laramie called her ruined, but here she was a cornerstone, her strength a match for his own. Morning brought trouble. Jed was splitting wood outside, the air crisp with spring's promise, when hoofbeats sounded. A man rode up, his wagon gleaming with varnish, his boots polished, his smile too wide. "Curtis Ellerby," he said, "a cousin of Delilah's, come for Tew." The children. His slick voice dripped with charm, but his eyes were cold, calculating. "They're kin, and I've claim," he said, holding a telegram about a train payout for orphans. Jed's axe stilled, his blue eyes narrowing. "They're under my roof," he said, his voice low, like thunder before a storm. "That's claim enough." Rowan, stacking wood nearby, froze, his green eyes sharp with fear. Maybel stepped onto the porch, her bonnet loose, her hands steady. "They're not goods to be traded," she said, her tone cutting through Ellerby's smile. The town buzzed with the news, whispers turning to stares at the trading post. Jed rode in for supplies, his jaw set, hearing mutters, "Strays, fool's errand." He bought flour, ignoring the clerk's smirk, but his fists clenched tight. Back at the cabin, Rowan paced, his voice shaking. "He don't want us. Just the money from the train." Jed knelt, meeting his eyes. "You ain't going nowhere," he said, his hand on Rowan's shoulder. "You're mine now." Rowan's throat bobbed, but he nodded, a spark of trust flickering. Maybel, mending Finn's shirt, looked up, her hazel eyes fierce. "We'll fight this," she said, and Jed felt her strength anchor him. The sheriff arrived days later, a telegram in hand, his face grim but kind. "Ellerby's got papers," he said, standing by the corral. "Court's setting a hearing." Jed's heart sank, but he nodded, his voice steady. "Then we'll be there." Maybel lied smoothly, claiming she'd known Delilah, a friend left behind when she stayed in Laramie. "I was with her when she died," she said, her voice unyielding. The sheriff blinked, caught off guard, and rode off, promising no haste. Jed met Maybel's gaze, a silent question. She shrugged, her smile small. "Needed saying, the Gia." Hearing came, held in Laramie's general store, the air thick with tobacco and judgment. Townsfolk packed the room, their eyes sharp, some hoping Jed would fall, others just curious. Jed stood tall, his wool coat patched, his blue eyes unwavering. Maybel, in her green calico, stood beside him, her chin high. Rowan, Wren, Laya, and Finn sat on a bench, their faces pale but resolute. Ellerby, in a slick suit, waved papers, his voice honeyed, claiming kin and duty. The judge, an old man with gnarled hands, asked Jed why he kept them. "Couldn't leave 'em to die," Jed said, his voice raw. "They chose to stay." Rowan stood, his twine-tied hair falling loose, his green eyes blazing. "Ellerby hit our ma," he said, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "Called Finn a burden, said she'd die. He wants the money, not us." The room stilled, even the gossipers silent. Wren stepped forward, her curls bouncing, clutching Laya's hand. Laya nodded, her boots scuffing the floor. Finn toddled to Jed, wrapping her arms around his leg, babbling, "Bah!" The judge's eyes softened, and he turned to Ellerby, whose smile faltered. "Leave," he said, his voice final. Ellerby stormed out, his boots loud on the wood, but the children stayed, their hands finding Jed's. Outside, the prairie glowed under a setting sun, the town's stairs less sharp. Jed felt Maybel's hand brush his, a warmth that promised more than words could. But the children's past, and Laramie's eyes, weren't done with them yet. Would Jed's victory hold, or would new shadows threaten the family he'd fought to keep? The Wyoming summer sun bathed Jed Waverly's ranch in golden light. A far cry from the snowy day he found 4 children by the rails. Rowan's quiet strength, Wren's joyful laughter, Laya's steady hand, and Finn's boundless energy had transformed his cabin from a widower's refuge into a home. Maybel Dunly, her heart as resilient as the prairie grass, had become their cornerstone. Her love a bridge to Jed's past with Clara, and a promise for their future. 3 years on, the children bore the Waverly name, their scars fading under the warmth of family. Yet as Jed watched them thrive, he knew their story held a lesson for all who'd been cast aside. a truth that could light the way forward. Badai. Cabin's pine walls glowed under the evening sun, their knots softened by years of care. Jed stood on the porch, his graying beard trimmed, his blue eyes tracing the prairie where wildflowers dotted the green. Rowan, now 14, led a calf to the corral, his brown hair loose, his green eyes bright with purpose. Wren, 12, her dark curls tied with a ribbon, hung laundry, singing a hymn Maybel taught her, her voice clear as a lark's. Laya, 9, in her leather boots, read a primer to Finn, 5, who clapped at each word, her sticky hands waving a daisy. Jed's flannel shirt, new and unpatched, was warm from the day's work, his heart full as he watched the children who'd once been strangers. Maybel stepped from the cabin, her auburn hair braided, her hazel eyes catching the light in her blue, calico dress. She carried a basket of cornbread, her smile a quiet promise. "Supper's ready," she said, her voice a melody that tied the day together. She'd married Jed a year ago, under a cottonwood by the creek, the children scattering. Petals, their laughter a vow of its own. Laramie's gossip had faded, worn down by Maybel's strength and the children's joy. She'd taught them to read, to mend, to laugh, her hands as steady as Clara's had been, her heart a hearth for their healing. The children had chosen the Waverly name after the hearing, signing papers in Laramie's clerk office with steady hands. Rowan carved a sign, Waverly Ranch, hung by the gate, its letters deep and sure. Jed had stood beside it, his throat tight, Maybel's hand in his. The county had settled Delilah's train payout, a modest sum, into a fund for the children's future, but no one came to claim them again. Curtis Ellerby had vanished, his greed no match for their bond. The town, once cold, now nodded at Jed. In the trading post, their stares replaced by quiet respect. Inside, the table was set with 6 plates, a far cry from Jed's solitary meals. Cornbread steamed beside beans and venison, the scent filling the room. Rowan helped Finn to her chair, her daisy tucked behind her ear while Wren poured water, her ribbon slipping. Laya set her primer down, her letters now fluid, her smile proud. Jed sat at the head, Maybel beside him, her hand brushing his under the table. "Grace," Jed said, his voice rough but warm, and they bowed, Finn giggling through the quiet. The meal was loud, Wren's stories, Laya's questions, Finn's babbles, yet it felt right, like the cabin had been waiting for this sound. After supper they sat by the hearth, the fire low but steady. Maybel taught Wren a new stitch, their needles flashing, while Rowan whittled a horse for Finn, his knife sure. Laya read aloud, her voice clear, stumbling only once, and Jed clapped, his blue eyes shining. He thought of Delilah, her name now spoken freely, her love living in her children's strength. Clara's memory, too, was softer now, her dreams fulfilled in this family Jed hadn't planned but wouldn't trade. Maybel caught his gaze, her hazel eyes a mirror to his heart, and he squeezed her hand. A silent vow. Outside, the prairie stretched. Under a starlit sky, its vastness no longer lonely. Jed stepped onto the porch, Maybel beside him, the children's laughter drifting through the open door. "They're ours," he said, his voice low, like a prayer. Maybel nodded, her braid brushing his shoulder. "Always were," she said, her smile a beacon. The ranch, once a place of loss, was now a home, its fences strong, its fields green, with promise. Rowan's sign gleamed in the moonlight, a testament to their choice. The 1880s West was a land of second chances, where the discarded could find roots if given time. Jed's story, like many, showed that family wasn't just blood. It was the courage to claim those who needed you. Orphans like Rowan, Wren, Laya, and Finn were common then, left to railroads or harsh winters. But kindness, like Jed's and Maybel's, could rewrite their fate. History teaches us that love, stubborn and quiet, can heal what's broken, building bridges where walls once stood. As the stars burned bright, Jed held Maybel's hand, the children's voices a song in the night. If this tale of found family moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Subscribe for more Wild West stories that warm the heart and join our community to keep the prairie's promise alive. The mice. Horizons wide and every soul deserves a home. What would you give to build a family from the ashes of loss, and what truths would you find in their light?